Bienvenido a Café de Datos, el podcast de Atlas, una startup mexicana. En este espacio hablaremos de analítica de datos, cómo monetizar información y tendremos invitados con los que platicaremos acerca de emprendimiento y transformación digital. Si estás liderando, planeas liderar o participas en una estrategia de transformación digital, Café de Datos es ideal para nutrir tus conocimientos de analítica e inteligencia artificial, conocer los métodos más populares de la industria, obtener nuevas ideas y disfrutar de todas las historias que tenemos para contar. Porque los datos van mejor con café. Arrancamos. ¿Qué tal? Bienvenidos al episodio número 45 de Café de Datos. Mi nombre es Pedro Vallejo.
Y aquí César Salinas.
Nos da muchísimo gusto llegar al 45 y no 45 grados y muchas cervezas, sino al 45 episodio de nuestro podcast. El día de hoy, pues ya hemos tocado durante esta tercera temporada algunos temas como el censo del INEGI, hemos tocado también algunos temas como las tendencias de analítica y particularmente de estos 45 episodios, solo uno había sido en inglés, pero el día de hoy nos vamos a dar la oportunidad de hacer un segundo. César.
Así es, el día de hoy tenemos justamente a una invitada muy especial que ahorita les vamos a introducir y vamos a cambiar a hablar en idioma inglés porque justamente pues ella es su idioma natal, entonces por ahí vamos a estar platicando con ella y justamente esto va por la línea, ¿no? O no sé si alguna vez se han preguntado si existe esta intersección entre analítica, arquitectura y urbanismo. Justamente Pedro va a introducir a nuestra invitada que tiene que ver justamente con estos temas, ¿no?
Así es, nuestra invitada es Ruth Nelson, ahorita lo pronunciaremos más adecuado, pero Ruth es una arquitecta que tiene muchísima experiencia y una especialidad en el área de analítica de datos y también en el tema de desarrollo de ambientes urbanos sostenibles. Ruth, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much. How are you?
Fine, thank you for taking a time in your Friday, and I ask in advance to our audience sorry because our English is not so great, but we are doing our best in order to communicate for this episode, right?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be on your platform, so thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. So I want to introduce the first question. Maybe our audience want to know more about what is your career path. I know and I understand you have several academic experience publications, and also you have quite a good taste with background in Zoom because you have a map over there in your background. So maybe you can introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Okay, great. Well, my name is Ruth Nelson, and I am a South African architect. So I studied a bachelor's and a master's degree in architecture. And I was always actually interested in the relationship between culture and architecture and space and people. And I worked in Cape Town for 3 years, and during that time as an architect, I had the opportunity to work in a number of different contexts from North America, across Africa, China, and it was always interesting to me to see how the architecture was formed in these different cultural contexts. And that led me to want to do more research, and I came across a course called Space Syntax at the University College London, Bartlett School of Architecture. And I applied and I studied there, which was amazing. Just a little brief introduction for those of you who don't know space syntax. It's essentially a theory that looks at the relationship between space and society. And it's a set of methods, a set of evidence-based methods where you can quantify this relationship. And it turns out that the relationship between space and society is actually a really important one. You know, how people move through space, interact and use space is really important, especially when you're thinking about the design of cities and you're thinking about the design of buildings. And essentially with these techniques, you can use them to maximize connectivity and accessibility to ensure that cities are more socially, economically, politically successful using data. I mean, we have the technology now in the 21st century to collect this data, to understand this data. And as architects and urban designers, we can use this as a part of our decision-making process. So that's essentially where I started getting into sort of geospatial analytics. And after studying in London, I moved to Mexico, and I'm now working as a consultant here with a startup called Quadricula. And we're kind of a platform for ideas. We're a multidisciplinary sort of startup, and my role is to really provide insights using data for open design, architecture. And I'm also involved with another branch called Greece Oxford, and essentially we provide insights for real estate analysis and risk analysis and that kind of thing. So that's what I'm currently sort of working on here.
It was a great introduction, Ruth. So at this point, where people just listen to you, what did you study, your career path and everything, there's a little bit of a ritual here with our guests in these episodes of the podcast, in which we ask our guest, in this case we ask you if you can drink a coffee with anybody from the history books, who would it be and what will you ask him or her?
That's a really interesting question. And it's a really hard question too. But I thought about it and I think about it. And I think that there's a lady who you might or not might know of. Her name is Jane Jacobs. And she was actually a journalist in the 1960s who got involved with urbanism and urban activism. And she understood innately through talking to people and through observation what makes good neighborhoods, right? And essentially that was very different to, her approach was very, very different to the other people in the urban design sort of urban designers at that time. She believed that what makes good neighborhoods are good streets, a mix of strangers and neighbors. Busy streets are safe streets. She believed that in good neighborhoods need mixed land use so that you can quickly access different needs. She believed that neighborhoods should be walkable and diverse, whereas at the time the modernist planners were separating everything out. And the funny thing is that today we talk about things like the 15-minute city in urbanism and, ideas that she spoke about back in the 60s in terms of mixed land use, walkability, accessibility, safe streets. We're talking about these ideas today as being very important. So she was way ahead of her time. And she also used evidence to inform her opinions. It might not be big data like we have now, but she observed, she spoke to people, which I think set her apart from the other architects and urban designers at that time.
Great. I actually was researching about Jane Jacobs right now, and she has like a lot of research and a lot of journals posts. One about Madrid, and you can find it in Spanish, I mean, for our audience, and you will find some research about Jane Jacob. It's super, super interesting character. Thank you for mentioning that. And Ruth, I want to continue with your career path. And you mentioned before that you have a few specialization in space syntax. And space syntax it's kind of new for everybody outside the architect world, maybe. But I want to ask you, space syntax it's the use of data, it's the use of evidence, and it's the use of of a lot of information to have a better planning of building cities and everything regarding our livelihood or neighborhood. So, but I want to understand better, why do you need some data skills, or maybe why do you need to understand how information geographic system works, how it will help to your work as a space syntax architect? Maybe you can mention something about that, please.
Of course, yeah, great question. Awesome question. So, well, I think essentially the thing is that cities are producing an incredible amount of data now, right? And we now have the tools to visualize, understand, test our designs, reiterate our designs using this data, and I think that as architects and urban designers, that gives us a huge advantage. We're no longer just relying on intuition, but we can incorporate evidence-based processes into our design decision-making process. There's a reason that the best architects tend to be incredibly old. Norman Foster, one of the best architects in the world, is in his 80s, right? Louis Barragan, he was obviously a very famous Mexican architect, and I think he only came to prominence, later on in his life. And that's because it actually takes a whole lifetime as an architect to really make good decisions. But now we have evidence, we have data, we can use this, and we can use this alongside creativity to make decisions. And I think really the challenge is, and the question is, why would you leave it to chance, right? When you're talking about cities which affect everyone, and you're talking about something that's probably going to last for hundreds of years, too, our cities last for hundreds of years, why would you take a risk and not use the evidence to make decisions? I think that things like space syntax basically enable you to have greater success with your urban designs and your architectural interventions.
And Ruth, I mean, as an architect, you have a lot of fields. Why space syntax? Maybe you have a personal background with urbanism, or why to choose this particular field around others?
So in the beginning, I spoke about how I'd always been interested in this relationship between culture, people, architecture. Architecture, like food, like music, right? It can manifest culture in different environments. That's why in Mexico you have a very particular music, very particular type of food, because it's almost a manifestation of your culture. And it's the same thing with architecture, actually. So that fascinated me, and space syntax really focuses on that relationship between society and space, and the way that people move, use, interact in space. And it's a set of techniques that particularly sort of focus on this and can be easily incorporated into the design process. And it's not only at an urban scale, it's multi-scalar. So you can use it at building scale too. So yeah, it's sort of a combination of neuroscience, architecture, urbanism, sociology. It's very transdisciplinary.
Thank you. And also, Ruth, just for a little bit of context, I studied finance. My partner here studied economics, and a lot of people that is listening to us right now, there are not experts in the field of architecture. So in a way of giving a little bit more context, can you describe or give us your definition of urban development, of urbanism, and why is it useful for people to understand it?
Sure, great. So urban, let's just break it down, right? Urban is essentially city, ciudad. It's not rural, right? Development, desarrollo, it's the evolvement. It's the development. So it's about how cities develop, right? That's what urban development is about. And generally cities develop when economies move from being rural-based economies to urban economies. And that's when you see cities really developing, people moving into the cities, because no longer is the economy based in the, you're seeing that a lot in Africa now. There's rapid urbanization happening because the economy is transforming there. And for me personally, I would say that there are three kinds of urban development. The first one would be organic urban development, and that's development that's kind of happened over a really long period of time. And you'll see it in European cities. You'll see it in African cities too, and in Mexican cities. But the thing is, we were colonized, right? Our countries were colonized, which meant a lot of our cities were destroyed through that colonization process. And these old cities developed over a very long period of time, and there was no master planner. They just developed, right? And they were very much based around walking, accessibility. They actually work very well naturally. And then we hit the 20th century, and a whole lot of urban planners, the profession of urban planning actually really developed in the 20th century, and you suddenly had master planners. And that's when they suddenly decided this very top-down planning, they decided to separate all the functions of a city out and really design it around automobiles, right? And that's created these cities which are really car reliant. It's actually put us in a really bad position because we rely on the car to get from place to place. And then I think there's a third kind of urbanism, urban development, and that's uncontrolled urban development. It's a bit different to organic. It's rapid urbanization, and it is happening in Mexico too, but it's mainly happening in Africa, where you're having this transformation of the economy. And that's when you get slums and things like that, because there's a lack of affordable housing. Yeah, it's kind of uncontrolled, and we, you kind of need a balance of some control. So it's, and it's something that we're all facing in terms of a lack of affordable housing. I think it's a huge issue in Mexico, in South Africa, across Africa. It's a big issue right now.
Perfect. And a little bit like following up this question, that in terms of the approach of the persons or the people that is working around these urban developments and these challenges more than problems that you just mentioned us, we kind of want to think that a data-driven approach to solve these problems it's the best way to do it. But who have to pay more attention in this like intersection or like fusion of data analytics and urbanism? Is there, in your opinion, architects that develop these data skills, or there's people that maybe from the data analytics field can evolve or can understand this urbanism kind of approach?
Yeah, I actually think the simple answer is actually everyone, I think, should be paying more attention to this, because cities affect everyone. Everyone has a stake in how your city works. So I think if you're just someone listening and you're not involved in urban design, or you're not an architect, but you are part of a community, and your government is doing something in your community, they're implementing something, ask for the evidence. Ask them why they're doing it, and ask them to show you the evidence, the support of their decisions. Why are they focusing on this implementation of a park, for example, and why are they putting it where they're putting, but your pavements are destroyed and you can't even walk to the park. You can't even access that park. Why are they doing so? Ask those kind of questions. And then, of course, government officials, policymakers, use data to base your policies on. Don't just, a lot of politicians do things because they want to show their power, and they do some grand thing in the city. Great, awesome, it looks great. But is it actually working for the people? Is it actually going to improve people's lives? And then as urban designers and architects start to involve these kind of processes in your design decision-making process. Use data, use techniques like space syntax techniques. People get things wrong, it's happened. Like there's an example in, I don't know if you know about it, but in 1974, Pruitt-Igoe, it's a housing complex in the United States in St. Louis. And this housing complex, it was affordable housing. It won awards just 10 years in the 1960s for its architectural design. It was so bad, it failed so badly and caused so many social problems that they blew it up. You can look at that online. They blew it up in 1974. So, architects make bad decisions sometimes. They think they're making the right decision, but it happens. So involve these things, involve these data in your design decision-making process.
Hey, esperamos que estés disfrutando de este capítulo que diseñamos especialmente para ti. No olvides que toda esta temporada de podcast está auspiciada por la startup Atlas, una startup de analítica con sede en Monterrey, en donde nos dedicamos a desarrollar soluciones que transforman datos en decisiones.
Y si has llegado hasta aquí, solo te queremos compartir un secreto. Próximamente lanzaremos una nueva iniciativa, Atlas Academy, en donde estaremos gratuitamente compartiendo un par de cursos y módulos sobre cómo realizar análisis. Así que síguenos en este programa para ser de los primeros y las primeras en utilizarlo. Continuamos con el programa. Gracias. The urban planning of any city might be seasonal. And why? Because you have like political characters that change every certain time, right? And with any new character, for example, you have like 200 ways to build a bridge, right? But maybe you have like a fancy way. You want the Golden Gate, or maybe you want like a super basic and cheap bridge. I don't know. I mean, it's a super simplistic example, but what I mean is like, imagine these things take it to urban planning or to more critical decisions that when you want to take it back, it will cost a lot to the financial of the citizens, right? And actually to the development of the city. Taking back the conversation to analytics and obviously to data, I want to ask you, what type of tools do you need in order to develop a good project with a space syntax?
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a great question. Well, I think that geographical information systems are really important, because that is, for those of you who don't know, that's essentially data that's kind of got coordinates in space. So you're linking the data to specific positions in space. And I think that is a really, really useful tool if you're talking about data, right? It's great to have it actually situated somewhere, right? In terms of, if you're working with any kind of data set, I would say, you need to think about the kind of database you're going to have in terms of where you're going to store your data, how you're going to quickly be able to access that data. That's really important. Are you going to use some kind of cloud-based service? What are you going to use? Personally, also, in terms of analysis, I incorporate statistical analysis into my process. So I use Python for that, bit of MATLAB. JavaScript's great for like visualization of data. And then for space syntax specifically, there's a program called DepthMap, which is free to download and open source software, and you can use that for space syntax analysis. But yeah, I also think incorporating evidence into your design process, you can also include, talking to people, talking to community members, like Jane Jacobs did, that's also part of gaining evidence, is consulting the community. And it's more an approach, an evidence-based approach is about making decisions and having reasons to back it up with evidence. And that could be talking to community members. It could be using big data. So that's sort of my response to that question.
Thanks. It was great. And at this point, Ruth, we were talking about concepts, right? We talked about space syntax, we talked about urban development, and a lot of conceptual things. But right now, can you give us an example or any particular project that you were involved in or that you studied from another part of the world that interested you and that uses this kind of skills that you just mentioned, and a little bit of space syntax or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you a couple of examples, but the first example I'll start with is a really well-known example, which is Trafalgar Square. It's a square that's in the middle of London, so most people know it. It's very close to Buckingham Palace, and that square actually wasn't working. It was empty, it wasn't working, and I suppose the city council, the local government, wanted to find out why it's in the center, but it just wasn't working, it wasn't being used. So they employed space syntax techniques. It's a company in London called Space Syntax. Involved in space syntax. They employed them, and they used their analysis to understand why the square wasn't working. And they worked alongside the architects, Norman Foster, a very famous architects, and they redesigned the square. And the square is super successful today. And though it was yeah, from my understanding, although it was in a very good kind of global position locally, it was really isolated, and they were able to show this through the analysis and able to make connections through pedestrian movement flow, which has now made the square a success, the success it is today, essentially. Yeah, do you have any questions about that, or should I move on to my next?
Actually, I have some pictures over there in that square. It's super famous and it's super cosmopolitan and everybody wants to be there. But I mean, I don't know if you have like a more close example. Maybe it don't have to be like a super square in one of the most important cities, but maybe something that anybody should demand in his or her city. Maybe, do you know, like at least in Mexico, because we were colonized, we have like a main square where we have a church and we have like the municipality, right? I don't know if you can mention another example that might be more frequent in other cities or might be applicable, for other cities.
Sure. Well, I mean, I worked on a project last year that was in Mexico, and it was an urban design framework plan. I was invited to collaborate with another company in a specific municipality, and my contribution was providing insights through data, analysis, visualization of data, analysis of the data, and this was used as a talking point with the community. It was used with the politicians. It was used with the urban designers. And that's the great thing when you have evidence, right? Because that you can talk about it in a way that it's evidence. It's not, I think that it should be this way. It's the data is showing that this would be the right response. So yeah, that's another example.
So thank you for your example, Ruth. It's super awesome that you're working in Mexico City problem. They have a lot of issues with transportation, and I think the spaces are really well. I mean, if you have any chance to travel to Mexico, for the people that are listening to us right now, you can use like bicycle, and you have like a lot of public transportation options that is super hard to find in our main city. Right now we are in Monterrey, and in Monterrey you need a car. If you don't have a car, you are like, okay, you will spend like 2 hours in public transportation because it's super inefficient. But I mean, the city is really beautiful, but we are not so connected. So I think that Mexico City is super nice to develop special syntax projects. Now, you mentioned the use of data to have like a diagnosis, or maybe to use it as descriptive. But you also mentioned that you like to use statistics in your approach. What are some examples where we can take advantage of analytics instead of maybe the traditional methods of planning urban cities?
Sure, great. I'll give you some more examples. So, I mean, there are a number of different examples, but I'll give you a few. So, I mean, for example, if you are an owner of a store, a retail store, and you're looking to place it somewhere in the city, you can use, a consultant such as myself to help you to understand, where would be the ideal location for that store in order to basically get the greatest amount of footfall, because that's really important when you're talking retail. You're wanting flows of people to walk past your store so that they'll ultimately walk in there. And even the placement of a store within a mall, for example, there are different flows even within a building, right? So deciding on the exact right location where you think will be optimal so that you can maximize the number of people coming into your store. I mean, that is one kind of example. And you can actually use space and tax techniques data to justify the location you eventually decide on, right? Another example is I've done quite a bit of research into the transport systems in Cape Town. In terms of the railway system, I basically did an analysis looking at the difference between accessibility provided by the railway system, informal minibus taxi system. We have an informal system. I think Mexico also has informal systems of transport here, as well as the recently implemented BRT system, bus rapid transit system. And I was able to use these techniques to actually understand which system was providing the highest level of accessibility and what neighborhoods didn't have access to walking, in walking distance to these different transport systems. And you can very quickly see where you would need to place a station to give, people, the most amount or densest amount of people in a neighborhood quick access to a transport system. So it quickly reveals inefficiencies, right? And it was actually really interesting, just to give you some insight into the research, discovering that the informal system was actually the best. It provided the highest amount of accessibility, far better than the BRT or the railway system.
Wow.
And yeah, really, really interesting, right? And you wouldn't have thought that. I didn't think that, and that's the power of evidence, right? I didn't think that.
And it's the market power. The supply was attending the demand. So if you build new routes around that demand, you will be efficient. Yeah, it's super clear.
Yeah.
And I think it's also like this concept of when we said informal, we kind of put it on the bucket of bad thing or not as good as. So I think that's kind of a problem too. But Ruth, taking advantage of the examples that you just mentioned, we've been working with a client, and they're kind of taking on an analysis that somebody else made on, I think it was San Sebastián in Spain or Madrid, I don't really remember, but they were trying to emulate that same analysis here in Monterrey specifically, and they start having some problems, some issues around gathering the data, because it was not the same data that Spain has available for the people and everything. And there's a lot of people that are listening to us right now and have these kind of same problems or challenges. So in your opinion, in your experience, what are the three main challenges that you encounter when you will be working with data?
Great question. Yeah, I think the three main challenges are kind of, I'm gonna give you obviously three challenges, but at different steps in that process of working with data. I think in the beginning, the main challenge is, actually, like you said, getting the data right, like actually getting the data, and also cleaning the data so that you can work with it in the way that you need to work with it, right? And that's quite a challenge when you're working with data. I think the second one is in terms of how you analyze the data. What methods are you using to analyze the data? Is it appropriate for the question that you're asking and the information you're trying to find out? So you need to be very careful about the method that you're using to analyze the data. Even, for example, in statistical analysis, are you using the right kind of statistical model to understand the data that you're working with? So that, I think, is a challenge. And then the third one, I think, is after you've done this whole process, you've got the data, cleaned it, worked with it, analyzed it, it's making it understandable for people, making it usable for someone who doesn't have a data background. And I think that's really great. That's a really great analysis, when you can take something complex and you can visualize it and you can explain it and they can understand it and people can work with it. And that's when I think you've done a really good job when you're working with data and you're trying to provide people information.
Thank you. Yeah, we also in that last feel that satisfaction. And I mean, when you work with people that have been worked in the same way for 20 years or 15 years, and now they are willing to change because they see the evidence might take another path or might be help taking decisions with more evidence, yeah, like that. And I mean, we are getting to the last part of our podcast, so I want to make some time to make a recap, Ruth. A todo el público de Atlas vamos a hacer una recapitulación. Ya estamos cerrando este podcast y en ese sentido vamos a ir viendo los temas que hemos repasado. So we are talking with Ruth Nelson. She's an architect and she has an expertise working with the space syntax and with data analysis. Right now, she introduced herself. She also is telling us about some of her projects, her techniques, and what are the tools that she prefers to use when she's working with planning cities and developing. Right now, Ruth, I want to ask you, what do you think are the trends that we have to pay more attention and maybe have direct effects on your main field of work? For example, I don't know, some people mention IoT because we will get a lot of more information with IoT, or maybe we can also think that a lot of big cities will emerge in the next couple of years. So I don't know, what do you think are the trends that we have to pay special attention?
Oh, I think there are definitely things that we're needing to respond to, and we're going to be put in positions as urban planners and architects that we just have to respond to. So I'll get into that. But firstly, for me, trend in architecture and urban planning, for me, it kind of implies like a fashion, like it kind of like talking about fashion, which I don't really like, because I think that you need to be planning and thinking really sustainably and thinking about how can we do something that's going to last for a really long time. So I don't really believe in like following any fashion trends or anything like that in architecture and urban planning. I don't think that's sustainable because trends come and go, right? But I do think that there are things which we are as urban planners, as architects, as human beings are just going to have to respond to. So one of them, of course, is climate change. It's having a huge impact, and it's going to have even more of a huge impact. And we're really going to have to start thinking very seriously about how we can make our cities more sustainable. And it comes down to things like making things more accessible, walkable, so that you don't have to get into a car to go and do something to get an economic opportunity, a social opportunity. You can just walk to it, right? We're hugely car reliant right now. In many cities across the world, and we're really going to have to think about how we can transform our cities so that things become more locally accessible. And then, of course, COVID is having a huge impact, of course, on our cities and planning. And I think it's also made us realize how important having access to good open spaces is. I mean, parks have been really important across the world in terms of the pandemic because people have been able to meet outside in parks. These open public spaces, I think, have become really important, and that's something we need to think about, as well as certain things are becoming a bit, like, for example, the office spaces, what are they now? They're not being used. There are hundreds of offices around the world. People are working remotely. So we need to think about that change in terms of the way that people are living. Again, there's more of an emphasis on the local, right? You're working from home. You want to be able to access things in walking distance, not travel long distances. People now have the option to work remotely. Maybe they don't have to live right in the city center because they don't have to go to work every day. And what are office spaces going to become? Are they going to be these cubicle things that they've been, or are they going to become maybe these like social meeting places that people, the office will come together once a month and have a party so that people can have that like social interaction, but everyone's actually just going to work at home. So it's interesting. There are going to be, I think those are two of the biggest things that we're just disruptive changes that we're experiencing, and we have to respond to. There's no chance. We're gonna have to respond to climate change. We'll be forced into that position.
Sorry, so I think with this question we are getting into the end of the episode. Just a quick surprise, another ritual like the one we did at the beginning of the episode, Ruth. There's like a little bit of game for our guests. It's called Rapid Fire. Okay.
Cool.
And the instructions are very easy. We are going to throw you some of the concepts about or around the topics that we just talked about, or topics that we know you know, no? And the main objective of this is, with no argument or no long response, you just told us if you think that concept is underrated or overrated, okay? So for example, we can throw you I don't know, universities, careers in the university, and then you mention overrated or underrated, okay?
Cool.
Perfect. So let me start with some of the easiest ones that we have right here.
Okay.
Around architecture, around architects, I've been seeing a lot of this 3D printing.
Yeah.
In your opinion, it is underrated or overrated?
I think it's underrated. Yeah, I think it's underrated. I don't think too many architects, some people are using it, but I don't think too many people have embraced that technology yet.
Perfect. Love it. You just mentioned climate change, and I think this next concept is related with climate change because it's renewable energy. What do you think about it? It is underrated or overrated?
It depends who you're talking to. People have a lot of, it's kind of a political issue, isn't it? It depends who you're talking to. It depends what circles you're talking to. I mean, underrated, I suppose. I think we need to be moving more towards it. There's not enough of it. So,
perfect.
At this point in time.
Perfect. Another concept I have right here, it's actually talked a lot about spaces and the way that urban development is getting into. But I have another concept here, virtual reality. This kind of new space or new dimension of space. Virtual reality. What do you think about it? It is underrated or overrated?
Again, it depends who you're talking to. It's not generally used too much by architects yet. So I think it's underrated, but I think it has huge possibilities. Yeah, it's an amazing technology. You can walk around a house without having the house built. I mean, that's amazing, right?
Perfect. I'll get the mic to my partner, Pedro, if you have any concepts here.
Yeah, so I want to ask you obviously about the Internet of Things, because I think it's a way we can get more information to develop cities in the future. So what do you think is overrated or underrated? Internet of Things sensors.
I mean, I think these technologies are still really new, and I would like to see where it's going. So in terms of sensing, I mean, I don't think it's something that's hugely been incorporated in many cities around the world. I mean, a lot of cities are just battling with basic issues right now. But I think in the future, we're going to see a lot more in terms of sensors and Internet of Things and collecting data, and cities adapting as they need to, to traffic flows, for example. A sensor picks up that there's more traffic and somehow that adapts things in the city. I don't know. I think people don't think about it enough. So I would say underrated.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I imagine the Inception movie or the Matrix, where the city is developing as somebody's programming the city, right?
Yeah. Things are adapting as the data comes in. That's amazing,
And what do you think regarding that point? Maybe the concept of smart cities. I listen a lot of things about smart cities in Toronto, maybe in Japan, because Olympics, Toyota want to build a really smart city. And I want to know, what do you think? It's underrated or overrated, the smart city?
I actually think it's overrated.
Okay.
And the reason is that I think there's actually no proper definition for what a smart city is. Right now, no one's properly defined in the literature what a smart city is. And I think it's used as this trendy term. Oh, we're creating a smart city. And is it really smart? Are you really incorporating, measures, data-driven measures, which are measuring different things and you're responding to them? I think people love buzzwords. But are you really incorporating data-driven processes in the design? So right now, I actually think it's overrated. I think it's just used too casually.
I think it as well. I mean, I want to think I don't, Monterrey is not a dumb city, because I mean, if you have the opposite, you have a smart city, then what do we have now?
What's
right?
the opposite?
Yeah.
That's hilarious, yeah.
And one last question regarding geographic information system and the use we give it today. Do you think it's overrated or maybe underrated, geographic information systems?
I would say generally it's still pretty underrated. I mean, I know it's a technology that's been around for a while, actually, but I think that more urban planners, more architects can use it. And people in general, even if you're not an urban planner or architect, there are loads of applications for geographical information systems, marketing, a range of different things. So right now, I would still say it's underrated. So, yeah.
Okay, so thank you. I think it's all for this game. I hope you spend some fun time with us. I think we enjoyed this time, and I don't know if you have any final word, and also if you have any recommendation for people that want to work in the space syntax area, or maybe understand more about how to use data in the urbanism world, right?
Sure, great. Well, I'm always open to chatting to people, and please reach out on LinkedIn. Recently got more involved in Twitter. Please reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk to people and give you advice personally. But there's a great book. It's called The Social Logic of Space. It was written basically by the founders of Space Syntax, Bill Hillier and Juliet Hansen. It's a great introduction to the theory of space syntax. So if you're interested, I would recommend getting hold of that book for space syntax. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I want to mention Santiago Hasso, our friend that was the matchmaker for this podcast, and he actually recommended me to read this book. And I was like, okay, I mean, I want to be informed to interview Ruth, but I actually Googled this and enjoy a video, a 1 hour video of a space logic, and I will. It's another recommendation for people that only want to spend 1 hour,
understand a little bit.
Hours.
Yeah. Not have to read a whole book. Yeah.
Before, because of course the whole book has a lot of value. But thank you a lot, Ruth. Really, I appreciate the time you take it. It was super useful, the information you gave us today.
Awesome. No, thank you so much for having me on your platform. It was wonderful chatting to both of you. So thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Perfect. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure and nice to meet you.
Awesome. All right.
Hasta la próxima. Gracias.
Hasta aquí el podcast de hoy. Gracias por escucharnos. Puedes seguir disfrutando de tu café y aprendiendo de analítica de datos en nuestro blog, con más de 180 columnas acerca de analítica, emprendimiento y transformación digital. Visita blogdatlas.wordpress.com y disfruta del contenido. Finalmente, no olvides suscribirte a Café de Datos, el podcast de Datlas. Hasta la próxima.